How does the Shinto tradition determine specific days for festivities?
Carrying on the Chinese custom, Shinto tradition has designated certain days, each month auspicious and certain others inauspicious for religious celebrations. The days most favored include the 4 each lunar month that correspond with the new and full moons. The 1st and 15th, and waxing and waning half moons, around the 7th/8th and 22nd/3rd. Since solar months are longer than lunar months. Festivals that retain the same day and month numbers they once had in the lunar calendar, e.g. 7th of the 7th, do not always correspond perfectly with the lunar event that originally made certain days auspicious and others not. Calculation of the beginning of a festival day begins with the eve of the feast, Yoimatsuri. Special days begin at sunset on the eve and last through sunset of the actual festival day, Hanmatsuri. Japanese call the actual day of a feast Saijutsu. Large-scale annual matsuri associated with a particular shrine, such as observance of the anniversary of the shrine's founding, are called reisai, regular festivals. These are distinguished from lesser festivals or national occasions such as those associated with the imperial household.
How do Muslims deal ritually with death and mourning?
In most places Muslims retain the ancient custom of burying the unembalmed body before sundown on the day of death. Family members generally prepare the body with purification rituals, similar to those used prior to prayer or to remove some ritual impurity. Sometimes mourners will say special prayers in the mosque after the regular ritual prayer, with or without the body. Basic prayers include the takbir, saying Allahu Akbar, pronounced takbir, spoken 4 times, interspersed with longer devotional prayers calling down blessings on the deceased and on all present. In the United States, Muslim obsequies often occur in funeral homes, always with a closed casket. There the imam of the mosque leads mourners in prayer and may also deliver a brief eulogy. American funerals often do not occur immediately after death as in some other countries. At the cemetery, mourners gather around the grave and offer special burial prayers called janaza, pronounced janaza. Muslims do not practice cremation. Bodies are buried in such a way that if turned onto their right side, they would be facing Mecca. Following burial, mourners generally gather to express condolences either at the family home or in a space set aside specially for the purpose. Some families arrange to have a Quran reciter present, or else play recorded recitation for silent reflection.
Do Christians pray in any particular language?
Use of sacred liturgical languages goes back to early Christian times. Aramaic and Hebrew were the languages the first Christians inherited from Jewish tradition. But before long Latin and Greek would become the dominant liturgical languages of Mediterranean Christendom. Along with such regional Middle Eastern tongues as Coptic, Arabic, Armenian, and Syriac.
What are the 10 Commandments?
Also known as the Decalogue, the so-called Ten Commandments are based on Exodus 20:1-17. In which God speaks to Moses at Mount Sinai and reveals his 10 words on inscribed tablets. There is no single, definitive text of the 10 Commandments. Rather, various denominations of Jews and Christians alike have boiled down a relatively lengthy message into their own renderings of 10 brief and direct statements. For the most part, they embody the following 10 directives: you shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make unto yourself any graven image. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not kill. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor.
What signs or symbols distinguish Muslim ritual or religious specialists?
There is no ordained Muslim clergy as such, but a category of specialists. Known as religious scholars, sometimes wear distinctive garb. Style and color generally depend on variant traditions in the country of origin. Many religious scholars from many lands prefer the fez wrapped in the white cloth, signifying that the wearer has made Hajj. Some, from the Sudan for example, wear a white turban. Shiite mullahs and higher-ranking scholars in Iran and Iraq often wear a black turban that identifies them as Sayyids. Descendants of Muhammad through his daughter Fatima and her husband, Ali. Size, color, number of turns, and so forth, allow a practiced eye to distinguish national and sectarian connections. Members of Sufi orders often wear special clothing, particularly during their prayer gatherings. Various organizations have unique headgear, sometimes using colors or varied ways of wrapping the basic cap with windings to indicate rank or status within the order.
How important is ritual in Confucianism and CIT?
There is perhaps no more fundamental notion in Chinese religious thought than that of Li, proper ritual. The Chinese term is composed of two elements meaning sacrifice and spirit more precisely. Contact with the upper world combined with a character that once depicted a sacred vessel. It applies to all religious ceremony, from the most popular to the most official imperial cultic worship. Historically overseen by a ministry of rites. State rituals have generally been the most formal and precise. Pre-modern ritual practice distinguished several levels of ceremony. Supreme offerings, performed mostly by the emperor himself, addressed heaven. Earth, the forebears of the emperor and empress, and the deities of earth and seed. Middle offerings propitiated sun and moon, ancestors of previous reigns. The god of agriculture called Emperor Shen Nung, and the goddess of silk production, Lei Ziyu. Lower offerings occurred in local or regional state temples and revered Guandi as deity of war, Wenzhong as deity of literature, and sage Emperor Fu Shi, among others. When Confucius spoke of Li, he had in mind all of these, plus the entire range of ceremonies enacted on a smaller scale or in private. But more than that, he conceived of Li as informing all proper human relationships.
How would you sum up Confucianism's historical relationships to other traditions?
Confucianism's most important and enduring interreligious relations have been with Buddhism and Taoism. There have been periods during which Confucians have had more or less cordial dealings with representatives of the other two ways of China. But since so much has often been at stake, especially in terms of imperial patronage, Confucian scholars have frequently leveled serious criticisms at Taoist and Buddhist views. For example, Confucians have sometimes faulted Buddhism for being too otherworldly, too disconnected from the ordinary problems and needs of regular people. Confucians generally interpreted the Buddhist ideal of celibate monastic life as an abdication of filial devotion and the responsibility to perpetuate the family lineage. Taoists, on the other hand, have characteristically struck Confucians as naive in their conviction that, if left to themselves, people will naturally follow an exemplary leader. Taoism's emphasis on doing things nature's way leaves society too vulnerable to simple lawlessness. In addition, the Confucian tradition's strong emphasis on education seemed to many to be irreconcilable with Taoism's more organic and seemingly anti-intellectual approach to learning. When Confucian tradition began to come into prominence during Japan's Tokugawa era, it found an increasingly hostile official response from representatives of Shinto. Confucianism, Shinto authorities argued, was a non-Japanese influence and therefore undesirable. By that time, however, Confucius had already made an indelible impression on Japanese society.
What is the meaning of Torah? Do Jews believe Moses wrote it all? What about oral Torah?
Torah is a Hebrew word generally translated teaching or instruction. In reference to the Hebrew scriptures, Torah means the first 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy. According to tradition, Moses himself composed the whole of the Torah under divine inspiration. This ancient attribution has the benefit of lending maximum authority to the earliest sacred texts by association with the man most identified with the divine revelation that shaped the faith community known as Judaism. Modern scholarship has demonstrated convincingly the historical improbability of the traditional attribution. In its most general sense, Torah means revealed or divine law, all that God requires of Jews. But as the Jewish community has grown and spread, moving into new lands and cultural settings, interpreting the scriptural Torah in practical terms has presented challenges. When Ezra led a group of Jews back to Israel from exile in Babylon in the late 6th century BCE, he confronted a problem: many Jews no longer knew Hebrew. In order to teach them the Torah, Ezra commissioned scholars who could translate the Torah into Aramaic as it was being read aloud to the people. That translation, or paraphrase, was itself a kind of commentary on the sacred text. Thus began the phenomenon called oral Torah. From the 5th century BCE on, classes of special scholars would oversee its elaboration. One generation would pass oral tradition down to the next until it became so extensive that it had to be written down to be preserved. Then a new class of scholars would initiate commentary on the now written oral law, extending the process further, until once again the burgeoning oral tradition had to be committed to writing or be lost forever.
How did Buddhism become important in China, Korea, and Japan?
Buddhism's spread across North and East Asia was an extended and complex process. That was part of the northern transmission begun as early as the reign of Ashoka. Serious missionary efforts commenced in China sometime during the 1st century CE. Within a century or so, a new wave of monk translators from India was engaged in large-scale proselytizing among the Chinese. Buddhism spread rapidly and flourished in the form of several denominations and schools. Some estimate that over half the population had accepted the new tradition by around 450 CE. A major persecution in 845 under a deist emperor did serious damage to all but the Pure Land and Chen, Zen, lineages. A Chinese missionary monk introduced Buddhism to Korea around the late 4th century. By the mid-6th century, Buddhism enjoyed royal patronage and spread throughout the Korean peninsula. In about 552 the Korean monarch sent the Japanese emperor, as a gift, an image of the Buddha and some sacred texts. The new faith soon found itself welcome, and adapted rapidly in the land of the rising sun. Monks from China and Korea continued to bring the teachings of various denominations to Japan during the 7th and 8th centuries. Those schools proved attractive to relatively small numbers of people. So during the early 9th century, 3 Japanese monks who had been studying in China brought back simpler teachings with greater popular appeal. Several schools based on Pure Land teaching enjoyed considerable success over the next 300 years. Then a new wave of Buddhist growth and development washed over Japan in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. Honen, 1133 to 1212, established the Pure Land School as a distinct denomination. And two Japanese monks founded the main branches of Zen Buddhism.
Are there religious hierarchical structures in any branch of Islam?
Sunni Muslims constitute the vast majority of Islam's global membership. Since the generation that succeeded Muhammad, the dominant ideal of governance has been that a leader should be first among equals. Centuries of caliphal splendor might persuade a student of history that a type of monarchy was the preferred form of Islamic governance. In practice, many of the most powerful Muslim rulers over the centuries have at least tried to call the shots religiously as well as politically. Nevertheless, Sunni Islam has never evolved quite the kind of hierarchical structure found, for example, in Roman Catholicism. Muslim authority structures in various countries and regions often take the form of councils of religious or legal scholars, or of imams. In practice, jurisdiction in matters of religious law and discipline is limited generally to the confines of modern nation-states. Following a very different model, the largest branch of Shia Islam, Twelver or Imamite Shi'ism, has evolved a much more centralized authority structure. As a result of the Iranian Revolution of 1979, the Ayatollah Khomeini and his followers sought to replace a monarchy with a theocracy. They established a pyramidal hierarchy of religious authority with Khomeini at the top. He was the most influential of a number of leading Ayatollahs, sign of God, and won the title Imam by virtue of his dominance. Below him was a cluster of grand Ayatollahs and a larger group of lesser Ayatollahs. Just beneath them were two ranks of religious scholars with the title Hujjatul Islam, Proof of Islam, and finally the several thousand mullahs, from a word that means roughly master, reverend, who staffed the country's mosques.
What are some of the main Protestant communities that arose out of the Reformation?
As a result of the Reformation and associated movements in late medieval Christendom, four large families of Christian communities began to develop. Among the earliest were those identified with the reformer Martin Luther. Today a number of structurally distinct churches, all calling themselves Lutheran, have local branches all over Europe and the United States especially. Out of the reformist teachings of John Calvin have grown a variety of ecclesial bodies. Most notable are the half-dozen or more Presbyterian churches, which trace themselves directly to John Knox, c. 1513–72, a Scottish reformer much influenced by Calvin's thought. The second group are known as the Reformed, including the Evangelical and Reformed Churches. A still more varied group of churches developed out of the so-called Radical Reform. From the Anabaptist wing of that movement came the numerous different Baptist churches as well as the Mennonites. From the Congregationalist wing arose the several Congregational churches, from which the United States organizations called the Unitarians and Jehovah's Witnesses split during the 19th century. While the Reformers in Europe organized their various communities. King Henry VIII proclaimed himself head of the Church of England, now no longer obedient to the Bishop of Rome. From that original movement, also known as Anglicanism, have emerged the Protestant Episcopal and Methodist churches. The latter beginning with the teaching of the once Anglican John Wesley, 1703–91.
What are parent and established and universal religious communities?
From the distant perspective of at least several centuries we can look back into history in search of the origins of major religious traditions. Though we will never be entirely sure in some cases when a given tradition actually began, or when it became distinct enough from its religious surroundings to be identifiable as a separate entity, we can develop some useful general notions. But it helps to keep in mind that most of our judgments in this regard are quite relative.
Is there a standard Hindu group or individual liturgical worship?
Ordinary daily puja is often communal in the sense that a number of people, such as an extended family, might make an offering together. But puja is not strictly speaking a congregational ritual. Some sub-communities, such as those living together in ashrams or members of other exclusive groups, engage in congregational ritual as a matter of course. In general, Hindus join in larger group rituals for special occasions. These may involve congregational singing or chanting of prayers or scriptural texts. Practices called kirtana or bhajana. Various forms of individual ritual prayer offer devotees opportunities to sanctify time alone wherever they may be. A form called japa, muttering, recitation, is the most widespread. Devotees repeat a mantra, sacred syllable or phrase, and keep track of their repetitions with a string of beads, often 108 in number, called a mala, garland. Reciting names of the deity is the most popular type of personal prayer. As in the mantra Hare Rama Hare Krishna repeated by many devotees of Vishnu. Hindu texts distinguish 14 kinds of japa, depending on variables such as purpose, physical posture, and method, whispered, voiced, or murmured. Processions are another important form of congregational worship. On special occasions, the priestly staffs of local temples mount a processional image of one or more deities on shoulder-borne platforms to be paraded through the streets. Worshippers often join in, or stop and catch a glimpse of the passing icon.
Is there a Shinto creed?
Shinto beliefs, like those of Daoism and the Chinese community traditions, have never been reduced to a concise formal summary statement. If one were to produce a brief Shinto creedal affirmation, it might go something like this. I believe that sacredness surrounds me, that it pervades all things including my very self, and that the all-suffusing divine presence is ultimately benevolent and meant to assure well-being and happiness for all who acknowledge it and strive to live in harmony with it. Shortly after the Meiji Restoration in 1868, the imperial authorities formulated the rough equivalent of a brief creedal statement, called the Three Great Teachings, in an attempt to enhance the emperor's status. The three teachings included patriotism and respect for the kami, the establishment of heavenly principles in relation to human culture, and dedication to the emperor and his pronouncements. Authorities interpreted the creed in the context of worship of the sun goddess Amaterasu, and the other chief deities in the creation myth. Although it approximated a creed in some ways, this statement was more like an acknowledgement of the importance of underlying religious conviction for the good order of Japanese society.
Are there cyclical Shinto observances, such as feasts that happen regularly but not annually?
Some gatherings still take place on set days in certain odd-numbered months, but not monthly. For example, a practice called waiting for the sun, himachi, finds people gathered private residences on the 15th day of the 1st, 5th, and 9th lunar months to keep vigil until dawn. A Shinto priest is often among the celebrants during the same months, but on the odd-numbered nights of the third week. People come together in groups awaiting the moon, Tsukamaki. September's full moon is especially beautiful, for it falls in the 9th month and is known as the harvest moon. Participants celebrate the lunar beauty with special songs and food. These gatherings occur only in homes. Some people still make special arrangements to observe their unlucky year age. 42 for men and 33 for women, with rites at a shrine to ward off misfortune. They may take precautions by means of extra rituals of purification on that day. Some regard certain days each month as fortuitous connection days because they associate them with particular kami, and such days often occasion shrine visitation.
Is there a standard Islamic group liturgical worship?
Islamic ritual prayer, performed 5 times daily, is called salat, from a root that means to make holy. Whenever Muslims gather, they perform the ritual prayer together. That applies not only to the prescribed Friday midday congregational prayer but to any of the set times at which two or more Muslims come together any day of the week, whether in the mosque or elsewhere. As with all Muslim ritual practice, worshippers preface this prayer with the clearly stated intention. Naya, pronounced Niya, saying I intend to pray the dawn, for example, Salat. From 2 to 4 cycles of standing, bowing to place hands on knees, Ruku, pronounced Rukoo. Sitting on the heels, Jalsa, pronounced Jalsa, stretching forward toward prostration. Sajda, pronounced Sajda, to place hands flat on the floor at shoulder width. And touching the forehead to the floor, make up the fundamental Salat ritual. The number of cycles, Rak'ah, pronounced Rak'ah, depends on which prescribed prayer one is performing.
Do all Jews belong to the same large group?
Jews have formed a number of important sub-communities throughout their history. Though there are generally fewer formally constituted denominations, sects, or other subgroups in Judaism than in most other major traditions. That is quite remarkable, considering the relatively small global population of Jews and the enormous diversity of cultures in which Jews now live. Major differences among Jewish communities appear most frequently in the relative strictness of ritual observance. Variations in theological views are also noteworthy in some cases, but they are less critical. Strictest in observance are Orthodox Jews, with conservative communities somewhat less strict. Further removed from the nearly all-inclusive adherence to biblical and traditional practices stands Reform Judaism. And most flexible of all, both doctrinally and ritually, are the Reconstructionists.
How did other Jewish communities develop outside of Israel?
Small pockets of Jews had grown up in various places in the Middle East since at least the early days of the monarchy. Foreign alliances allowed Jewish kings to bargain for power and influence and opened economic doors. With the trade routes came traveling merchants, some of whom decided to relocate. The first major Jewish communities outside of Israel and Judah were the result of the various mass deportations. By the time Cyrus had made a return possible, Mesopotamian communities had been established for over 2 generations. With the threat of imminent persecution lifted by a tolerant ruler, many Jews simply stayed in Iraq. There they founded thriving cultural and religious institutions, including the academies that went on to produce some of Judaism's most important legal and theological works. Under successive political regimes with varying policies toward religious pluralism, Iraqi Jews experienced uneven fortunes, but on the whole did much better than merely survive. During the first several centuries of Islamic rule from the capital cities Damascus and Baghdad, Jews enjoyed considerable autonomy and even held high government office. But after the invasion of the newly Islamized Seljuk Turks from Central Asia, Jewish life in the Middle East changed dramatically. The Seljuk Sultan effectively abolished the offices of Exilarchate and Jayanate, which had been the backbone of Jewish autonomy. Meanwhile, Jewish communities had grown in Europe since Roman times and had begun to thrive in Germany under Charlemagne. Now many Middle Eastern Jews would look to Europe in hopes of another new start. From the 11th century until at least the late 19th, the center of Judaism would shift from the Eastern Mediterranean to Central and Eastern Europe.
What rites do Shinto practitioners perform in their shrines?
When worshippers go to their local or larger regional shrines, they may engage in several types of ritual called worship gestures, omeri, depending on the occasion. A simple list of 4 P's sums up the essential ingredients of Shinto ritual: purification, presentation of offerings, petition or prayers for blessing, and participation of the assembled worshippers. For ordinary, everyday prayers, in which they express a whole range of needs and concerns. Worshippers typically perform a simple offering before the sacred presence. Alone or in small groups, they enter the shrine precinct and proceed along the path, passing beneath perhaps several torii gates, to the purification font. There they take some water to cleanse the mouth and hands as necessary preparation. A ritual action called misaji, for approaching the holy place. Moving to the front of the shrine, worshippers announce their arrival by ringing a bell that hangs over the threshold of many shrines. Ringing the bell may be either for quieting the mind or summoning the kami, with or without the bell. All toss a coin in the offering box, then bow and clap their hands twice to summon the deity. After making a brief prayer, they bow twice, one deep and one slight bow, and then depart. For special occasions, individuals or small groups can arrange for the services of the priestly staff. Rites that last from 10 to 15 minutes take place inside the front worship hall, Hayden. Various spiritual purposes of the rituals include divine blessing and protection, the opportunity to communicate with the kami about countless daily happenings and concerns, and expressions of personal dedication to the divine beings. These services are available most days in shrines with larger staffs. For the tradition has set aside no one day of the week as a canonical day of worship. In larger shrines, the priestly staff also make daily morning and evening offerings to the kami, in addition to the various daily rites. Shrines host numerous events throughout the year for special occasions, as described above, Matsuri.
What were the 4 passing sites?
On several occasions the young Gautama had to leave the confines of the palace. Although his father instructed his servants to clear the road of any unsightly reminders of human frailty, Gautama would nevertheless find himself asking the hardest questions of all. On one excursion, he saw someone bent and struggling to walk. Old age, his servants explained, a hardship many people must eventually face. Another time, Gautama spotted a leper lying by the way in pain. That was illness, his servants explained, it happened to many people. Then one day Gautama's entourage came across a funeral procession. Death, said his servants, and no one escapes that. Finally, according to the traditional account, Gautama saw by the road a young man who obviously possessed nothing and yet seemed content. That was the world-renouncer Shuddhodana so badly wanted his son not to become. The traditional account holds that all of the four experiences resulted from divine intervention. The gods assuming the roles of suffering human beings so that Gautama would be moved to take the next critical steps in ensuring the possibility of enlightenment for humankind. The clearly formulaic account admirably sums up the key issues that would eventually provide the foundations of Gautama's enlightenment and Buddhahood.
Do Hindus really believe in and worship many gods?
Hindu tradition uses language and symbolism that seems at first glance to suggest what is called polytheism, worship of many deities. Most Hindus, however, will tell you they believe in God, one transcendent spiritual reality. Since human beings are incapable of grasping the fullness of divine truth in anything like a comprehensive and definitive way, believers are left with a basic choice: either they keep quiet about matters of faith and belief altogether, since the realities will forever elude ordinary language and symbolism, or they indulge in ordinary forms of expression, ever aware that those forms will never be adequate. Hindu tradition has become a monument to the second option, and the world of religious belief is all the richer for that.
What does one do to convert to Islam?
Converting to Islam is a relatively simple matter. Interested individuals have typically already done some basic study of the tradition, but no prescribed course of religious education is required or expected. Naturally, most Muslims believe that the more converts know about the tradition and its history, the more likely they can make an informed decision. Before entering into the brief ceremony that renders a candidate officially Muslim, the convert performs the major purification ritual called ghusl. Formal assent to the tenets of Islam entails a simple repetition of the Shahada before any two adult male witnesses.
What are the earliest Christian sacred writings?
Two broad types of literature comprise the bulk of the Christian scripture. Among the earliest documents are the letters of Paul. Tradition attributes 14 of the New Testament's 27 books or epistles to Paul. But it seems likely that several were penned under a pseudonym. The largest and most important of the texts are addressed to local Christian communities collectively. Romans, and 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, and 2 Thessalonians. 4 are addressed to individual Christian leaders with whom Paul worked. And 2 Timothy, Titus, Philemon. The addressees of the letter to the Hebrews, almost certainly not written by Paul, are curiously diffuse and not geographically identifiable as are the local churches. These epistles provide a great deal of information about the spread and organization of the early church, and, to a lesser degree, about the personality of this man of prodigious energy called Paul. A man some regard as the true founder of Christianity. 7 other letters, 2 attributed to Peter, 3 to John, 1 to James, and 1 to Jude, afford small glimpses into the variety of theological and practical issues facing the Christian diaspora. The communities developing beyond the central Middle East. At the heart of the Christian scriptures are 4 remarkable documents called Gospels, good news. Mark's Gospel, likely the earliest, is also the shortest of the 4. Matthew's is addressed largely to those of Jewish background, and Luke's followed within the next 20 to 30 years. Luke's also has the distinction of being part of the only consciously crafted 2-volume work in the New Testament, completed by Luke's account of the post-Jesus church in the Acts of the Apostles. Because of their similarity of perspective and emphases, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels. John's Gospel, often referred to as the most theological of the 4, almost certainly came last, around the end of the 1st century CE. Last but not least is the Book of Revelation, also called the Apocalypse. Tradition attributes the work to John the Evangelist, since the work seems to date from around the same time as the 4th Gospel.
What about animals or other natural objects?
Pomegranates, ruminum, are a very commonly used symbol. They appear on all sorts of objects. Most importantly perhaps on the tops of the 2 spindles that hold the Torah scrolls in many synagogue. Bursting with countless seeds, the pomegranate is a reminder of the innumerable meanings one can find in the divinely revealed scripture. As this single fruit contains so many parts, so is all of our world's perplexing multiplicity contained in ultimate unity. The only object that apparently has survived from Solomon's temple is a tiny pomegranate carved of ivory and bearing the inscription, belonging to the temple of the Lord, holy to the priests. Some Torah scroll finials further decorate the pomegranate with small bell towers. Imagery of the 12 tribes is often associated with animal symbolism.
What does the crescent moon and star symbol mean?
Crescent moon embracing a single star adorns the flags of a number of modern nation-states with majority Muslim populations. The sign is almost certainly not of Arab origin, and the Ottoman Turks may have appropriated the symbolism from Byzantium. At first, the symbol appeared on the flags of lands formerly under Ottoman rule. But other states with no historical connection to the Ottoman Empire have also adopted the imagery. Popular understanding of the symbol usually identifies the crescent moon as the essential indicator of the beginning of Ramadan, the 9th lunar month. More generally still, the symbol reminds some of the lunar cycles that regulate Islam's religious calendar. Appearing frequently at the top of domes and minarets, the symbol has become a generic reminder of Islam, much the way the cross has for Christianity and the six-pointed star for Judaism.
Are any other regular observances significant in the Jewish ritual year?
Three days of fasting and mourning, 2 in summer and 1 in winter, are connected to remembrance of the first and second temples. Tesha B'Av, the 9th of Av, is a day of lamentation for the destruction of Solomon's temple in 586 BCE. Israeli Jews and pilgrims gather at the western wall of the Herodian temple to grieve over the loss. The short biblical book called Lamentations is a traditional reading for the occasion. Associated rituals have given the remains of the temple the popular name the Wailing Wall. 8 days after Hanukkah, on the 10th of Teves, another fast commemorates the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar's initial siege of Jerusalem in 587 BCE. In more recent times the occasion has become associated with mourning for victims of the Holocaust. On the 17th of Tammuz, a less popular occasion, some Jews fast to recall the times when the armies of Nebuchadnezzar and Titus first broke through the walls of the temple in 587/6 BCE and 70 CE, respectively. Finally, there are two other minor observances. One is the 15th of Shavat, the New Year for trees, Rosh Hashanah Eli Ilanot, a day of thanks to God for the bounty of the earth. The other is called Sinchat Torah, rejoicing in the Torah. The day after the Feast of Booths, Jews celebrate the end of the annual cycle of liturgical readings, with processions in which the scrolls are carried around the synagogue with children leading the crowd.
Is there a standard Confucian group liturgical worship?
Confucianism is surely among the most ritual-conscious traditions in history. Each day in the life of a Confucian is full of an awareness of the importance of ritualized actions and ways of thinking. But apart from the larger annual or semi-annual public ceremonies, and the regular acknowledgement of revered ancestors, there is no communal Confucian liturgy as such.
What sort of symbols and signs will I see in a Hindu temple?
First, you will remove your shoes as a sign of respect for a holy place. And to help keep it clean, since worshippers often sit on the floor. Very near the door you will see an image or statue of the elephant-headed deity called Ganesha. One of Shiva's two sons, Ganesha is the guardian of openings, beginnings, and travelers, and he generally bestows blessings on worshippers as they enter. Even Vaishnavite temples usually have a Ganesha at the door. Along the side walls you may see smaller shrines containing images of deities important in one or another denomination but secondary to this particular temple's devotional focus. Straight ahead you will see the central shrine, perhaps flanked by a pair of subordinate shrines holding images of deities directly related to the one in the central shrine. For example, if the temple is primarily dedicated to a manifestation of Vishnu called Sri Venkateshvara, as are temples in Pittsburgh and St. Louis, flanking shrines might house Krishna and Radha on one side and Rama with wife Sita, brother Lakshmana, and the monkey assistant Hanuman on the other. The subordinate shrines may have prominent spires somewhat shorter than that of the central shrine. If the temple serves a large and diverse community, other side rooms may be devoted to other deities. Vishnu's consort, Lakshmi, goddess of wealth and success, often has her own shrine, sometimes with a shikhara, whose external elevation is slightly lower than those of the central shrine and its flanking shrines. Another room might house one large and several smaller shrines dedicated to Shiva and his holy family. In the main Shiva shrine you will see an abstract symbol of power and blessing called the Linga Yoni, the principal and iconic symbol of Shiva. Alongside, smaller shrines will display images of Parvati, Shiva's wife, and their two sons, Ganesha and Skanda, also known as Kartikeya and Murugan. Many, if not all, images will be elaborately clothed and festooned with floral garlands. Decorative themes on the shrines might include images of guardian figures called doorkeepers and other protective symbols that look like small lion faces.
What is myth and why is it so important in the study of religion?
Enduring myth and great poetry have one very important thing in common: both tell the truth without fail. That may come as a shock to readers accustomed to thinking of myth as a synonym for just a story at best, and outright lie at worst. Read a favorite poem aloud.
Take away the soul and what remains?
Nothing, apparently. But the Buddha was not attempting to empty life of its meaning. He wanted people to change their minds about what matters most. Look hard at what motivates you. What can make you nearly desperate to achieve this good or avoid that evil? Look carefully, the Buddha argued. And you will see that the qualities that attract or repel you are deceptions. Probe deeply into your choices and you will see that what you are really looking for you cannot get from this possession or that person. Each being is simply what it is, and it is a serious mistake to treat your world as though it existed for you. As if what you value in each thing is its value. In a sense, the Buddha argued, all things are empty. In that they simply do not possess the soul that a grasping, craving person invests them with. Pile all your expectations onto some person or object as though you truly hope it will deliver what you want. And you are making the fundamental mistake. The notion of non-soul, anatman, is difficult to understand. But it is one of the Buddha's most provocative teachings.
What regular or annual observances have been part of Confucian tradition?
For many centuries Confucians celebrated with large feasts in the master's honor at both the vernal and autumnal equinoxes, corresponding with the 2nd and 8th lunar months. During the fourth of the night's 5 watches, celebrants paid homage to Confucius' ancestors and then moved to the central memorial hall at sunrise. Arrayed carefully across the entire main courtyard were row upon row of participants, arranged according to rank, with imperial bureaucrats along the sides and 6 groupings of students in the center. Before and within the memorial hall the offerings and sacrificial animals were arranged. These included a roll of silk, vessels full of wine, soup, and various foods, and a ritually slaughtered ox flanked by a pig and a lamb. A lengthy order of ceremony included specific offerings of each item. First to Confucius and then to the other sages enshrined in the main hall. This was accompanied by profound bowing and prostration, and songs of praise. A full classical Chinese orchestra punctuated by booming drum beats marked changes in the action. In addition to those semi-annual festivities, smaller semi-monthly observances included offerings to the spirit of Confucius at each new and full moon. In Korea, at the spring and autumn equinoxes, Confucians honor both Korean and Chinese sages at the Confucian University's shrine.
Is dance also a significant ingredient in Confucian and CIT ritual?
Once a central feature of many rituals in China, Confucian dance has been preserved as an art form only in Korea. During the semi-annual gathering to honor the spirits of Confucius and the sages at the Confucian University, and at the annual gathering to honor the kings of the Yi dynasty at the royal ancestral shrine, Dancers perform elaborate routines. Originally, Confucian dance was limited to male performers. Both military and non-military forms of dance make up the repertoire. Dancers gesture with the long pheasant feathers and small flutes they carry. Complex ritual movement was formerly integral to virtually all the major ceremonies of CIT. Whether in the courtyards of the Forbidden City or around the altars of the Temple of Heaven and other sacred imperial sites. Intricately choreographed scripts called for dance on a grand scale.
Does the sport of sumo wrestling have any Shinto connections?
Japan's ancient and still wildly popular sport of sumo wrestling is not itself a religious ritual. But it has surrounded itself with rituals associated with Shinto tradition. Once, these matches occurred on shrine grounds as part of the larger category of activities called divine entertainment. Today the bigger matches take place in specially decked out arenas and are scheduled in fortnightly tournaments at set times of the year. Action occurs under a shrine-like roof suspended high above the floor. Two enormous wrestlers, the heavier the better, in general confront each other in a raised circle of well-tamped earth bounded by the heavy braided ceremonial rope called the shiminawa. As they enter the ring, the giants sprinkle handfuls of salt to purify the space. They squat and spread their arms in an ancient samurai gesture, designed to assure opponents that they carry no weapons. A referee dressed in ancient ceremonial garb signals the beginning and end of a match and declares a winner, using deliberate, archaic gestures. Sumo champions are among Japan's highest paid and most popular athletes. The best of them do countless product endorsements and parades of sumo greats led Olympians into the arena when Japan hosted the Games at Nagano in 1998. Complex as the phenomenon has become in Japanese society today, sumo has its roots in the same simplicity and basic feeling for nature that pervades so much of Shinto tradition.
Does the shaman have a place in Shinto?
In ancient times, shamanesses were very important in Shinto circles. Today the shrine maidens, Miko, may represent a vestige of that ritual specialization of long ago. Blind female shamans called Itako still ply their trade in various parts of Japan. Strict asceticism marks the apprenticeship of young blind girls to older teachers. After lengthy training, the aspirant marries a kami symbolically to secure spiritual power and protection. Shamanesses perform the service of connecting with the kami world, sometimes functioning as spirit mediums. Some of the so-called new religions with Shinto roots give prominent roles to shamanesses. Ancient Shinto tradition associates certain forms of spirit possession with shamanesses, explaining their extraordinary powers in special circumstances. Newer sects such as Tenrikyo acknowledge that male or female shamans experience a kami descent. Kamigakari, in which the deity totally takes over the human being.
What is religion?
In its broadest sense, the term religion means adherence to a set of beliefs or teachings about the deepest and most elusive of life's mysteries. The word comes from an ancient Latin root, religo, that means to bind or to obligate. Religious persons join together in a shared quest to understand a host of perplexing questions.
What are some of the ways religious groups engage society at large?
Whether or not a particular faith tradition mounts major missionary efforts, it will invariably devise ways of reaching out to the larger community. Social agencies devoted to healthcare, disaster relief, feeding the hungry, and sheltering the homeless are an integral part of the institutional histories of most religious traditions. Though they may not be as well known and certainly do not generally have the resources as large international aid organizations, countless local Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, Christian, Jewish and other communities have given social concern high priority. For example, the Greater St. Louis Muslim community has extended its care to several thousand Bosnian refugees during the 1990s, tutoring the children and finding jobs for their parents. Study the history of important temples, synagogues, and mosques across the globe and you will encounter evidence of social outreach stretching back centuries.
Do people ever decide they want to depart from Daoism or CCT?
Membership in Daoism and CCT has rarely, if ever, been a matter of exclusive allegiance. Members of some major religious traditions, such as Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and, to a lesser degree, Hinduism, typically regard belonging as a kind of all-or-nothing affair. Either you're in, or you're out. Disagree with major tenets of the tradition, or neglect consistently and willfully to fulfill the minimum ritual and ethical requirements of the faith community and your membership is in question or has lapsed altogether. Religiously involved Chinese generally do not think about membership in those terms. Belonging is deeply rooted in national and local culture, integral to the very fabric of society. Individuals who drift away from regular religious practice have not necessarily left, so long as they have not entirely cut themselves off from family and social connections. Other family members might express regret that sons or daughters no longer find the traditional ways helpful and have chosen to delete that part of their heritage from their self-identities. And many today sense the gradual diminishment of traditional values and practices precisely because of this sort of attrition. but Chinese, whether deist or CCT, generally do not think in terms of leaving the faith, unless they do so with the intention of converting to a missionary faith, such as Christianity. In those cases, people do talk of leaving behind unacceptable beliefs and practices.
What are the principal historical stages in the evolution of Greater Hinduism?
A stage known as the Vedic period began as early as 4000 BCE. Some Indian scholars push the origins back as much as 3 or 4,000 years before that. Archaeological evidence from Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro point to a highly developed civilization in the Indus River Valley from around 2700 to 1500 BCE. Early texts suggest a religious culture centered on worship of numerous deities associated with forces of nature. Around 2000 BCE, there may have been a major population shift from the northwest of India to the Ganges plain as a result of the drying up of the Sarasvati River, once a prominent feature of the Indus Valley. The Vedic period comes to a close around the time of that shift. The period of the Upanishad scriptures and the Epic Age, from 1500 to 500 BCE, witnessed dramatic changes and the evolution of major new forms of religious expression. During these centuries, the Upanishads developed the speculative approach now known generically as Vedanta, the culmination of the Vedas. For the next millennium or so, 500 BCE to 500 CE, sometimes referred to as the classical period, new post-Vedantic sacred texts, called sutras, shastras, agamas, and earliest Puranas, formed the basis of a number of important schools of thought. From this period, too, came the written epics, the Ramayana and Mahabharata. Between around 500 and 1800 CE, the so-called medieval period, popular devotional theism, based largely on mythic narrative texts called the Puranas, spread across most of India. Beginning with the arrival of the British in the mid-18th century. The modern period extends into the mid-20th century, the declaration of India's independence, and the partition that created East and West Pakistan as separate Muslim states.
What good are the deities then?
They, along with the spiritually accomplished ones called sages and immortals, instruct humankind in the ways to achieve salvation. A clue to the place of many of these celestial beings in the grand scheme of things is their connection with the stars. Dozens of the members of the deist and popular Chinese pantheons are or have been associated with specific heavenly bodies or constellations. They are thus both visible and impossibly distant.
How and where do members of local Shinto communities come together?
Larger shrines provide the principal venue for Shinto community gatherings. The more elaborate shrines might have a dozen or more separate structures, each designed for a specific function. The ritual center includes facilities along the entry path for purification by water, as well as the various halls of worship and the sanctuary itself. There is often a separate facility in which the shrine ritual specialists purify themselves. Secondary shrine functions include a wide range of activities. Smaller buildings provide facilities for weddings, jishiki-den, sacred dance and performance of plays, kagura-den, and storage of the portable processional shrines called mikoshi. There is usually a sacred kitchen for preparing offerings and a small shop where worshippers can purchase mementos and items, such as cards on which to write petitions to be hung on special boards outside the main worship hall. Officials administer the whole operation from a shrine office, looking after all the more mundane concerns of any institution. That includes everything from scheduling of events and staff to arranging for supplies and paying bills. Smaller shrines naturally have fewer of these separate facilities, and the smallest often do not have resident priests. Shrines are organized in a variety of ways. Some are directly managed by hereditary priestly families still connected with powerful clans of old. Committees of local elders oversee many village shrines that lack permanent priests. Trade guilds, called zie, still worship together and manage their own shrines. Wealthy families sometimes even own and administer shrines just for their private use. Finally, some historic Buddhist temples have set up and maintained shrines in hopes of securing the protection of the kami for the temple. Some larger shrines attract worshippers from all over Japan, while most local shrines have relatively stable memberships of parishioners. But parishioners often have family or devotional ties to more than one local shrine.
What do Hindus think about history and time?
Imagine a bird flying past the Himalayas every 100 years, brushing the mountain peaks with the silk scarf it holds in its beak. What we call history is the time it would take that bird to wear the mountains flat. And that would be only an infinitesimal fraction of divine time. History is an infinite cycle made up of smaller, measurable cycles of creation and destruction, but even the smaller cycles are unimaginably long. Hindu myth says that God, manifested as Brahma the creator, unfolds the material world over and over. Each lifetime of Brahma lasts 100 divine years. Each day in the life of the creator deity is called a kalpa, lasting 4,320,000,000 years. Each kalpa, or great age, Mahayuga, in turn is made up of 4 ages or eons called yugas. The present cycle of human history began with the first yuga, a time of order and peace when the cosmic law, dharma, kept evil in check. During the second age disorder entered history. Dharma diminished as did the span of human life. There followed a third age, when evil gained still greater strength and Dharma weakened. Social fragmentation gave rise to the caste system and attempts to gain power through ritual sacrifice. We are now in the fourth and bleakest age. A time of darkness and lawlessness destined to end in 400,000 years. Then, after a period of quiescence, all will begin again, another day in the life of Brahma. Key concepts in Hinduism: Atman, the indivisible and indestructible spiritual center of each being, and the ultimate self underlying all reality. Avatar, a crossing over downward, a deities, especially Vishnu's descent into the world of human experience. Bhakti, participation, devotional relationship to one's chosen deity, a major path to liberation. Brahman, ultimate reality enveloping all appearances of multiplicity. Dharma, that which holds all things together, the cosmic law, religio-social propriety. One's individual religious duty, and one of the four acceptable goals of life. Jnana, knowledge, insight into the spiritual meaning of things, one of the principal paths to liberation. Kama, pleasure, one of the four legitimate goals of life. Karma, action, ritual, or ethical conduct and the consequences thereof. One of the traditional paths to liberation. Marga, path, way, method of spiritual progress toward liberation. Moksha, liberation from the cycle of rebirth, ultimate goal of Hindu spiritual practice. Samsara, journeying, the endless round of rebirth from which Hindus seek to be free. Yoga, joining, harnessing, system of physical and spiritual disciplines practiced by a yogi.